Welcome back to Smoked BBQ Source. I'm Ricer, and today I have a Snake River Farms 4-bone silver American Wagyu prime rib. And untrimmed, it weighed in over 11 pounds. In my opinion, Snake River Farms is one of the better purveyors in the market today. So if you're in the market for American Wagyu, check in the description below. I always feel that American Wagyu is a perfect grade for any type of special occasion prime rib. But don't worry, you can follow along with this recipe with whatever type of grade of prime rib you have. Because prime rib is such a high quality cut of meat, I want to make sure that I cook this to the perfect wall-to-wall pink perfection. One thing that I want to point out to all of you that are newer to cooking up a prime rib, don't get confused by the word prime. It has nothing to do with the USDA grading of this meat. And no, I'm not talking about the leader of the Autobots, Optimus Prime. Prime rib means that it's coming from the primal muscle that is located along the spine. And it includes a total of 7 bones. I got 4 of the 7 bones, and I hope the other person that has the other 3 smokes their prime rib to perfection like I'm going to. The biggest reason why I prefer to do a bone-in over a boneless prime rib is that those bones kind of make a little bit of a heat shield, ultimately ending up with a more evenly cooked from edge to edge prime rib. Plus, I also use a pan to catch some of those drippings, and that helps deflect that heat directly on the outer crust too. And the second reason, it all is just because of presentation. It looks a tad fancier. When you get a bone-in prime rib from a butcher, typically they're always going to trim off some of the fat and truss it up for you. If you want, you certainly can just season it up and start cooking it right away. But I prefer to trim my prime rib up a tad tighter. This way I can get more seasoning directly on that meat compared to flavoring up a big chunk of fat. There is a lot of intermuscular fat flavor in a prime rib, so trimming off a little bit of that fat cap certainly isn't gonna hurt this prime rib one bit. Especially when it comes to an American Wagyu prime rib. That thing is packed with flavor. Just be careful when you're trimming that outer layer of silver skin that you don't cut too deep. But having a really sharp bony knife is gonna make this task a breeze. I usually like to partially remove the bones on a prime rib because it's a lot easier to do it now compared to when it's hot and you're trying to get it served up. Get to the backside or the chine and just follow along the bone pattern and loosen it up a tad. If you got a good knife, it's really easy to do. Just follow along those bones and trim it as close as you can. The bonus is you can go ahead and add a little seasoning in between those bones and that chunk to give it a lot more robust flavor. Trussing a prime rib is very important. Not only does it help the looks of it, it also keeps that meat a lot tighter so it cooks a lot more evenly. We did trim off a bunch of that outer fat, which tends to loosen it up a tad, so we need to cinch it back up so we have a nice solid chunk. I'm not gonna French this prime, but I will make a couple slits in between the bones so our twine has a little bit of guidance so we can get those strings nice and even. So you are going to need some butcher twine. And don't be stingy when it comes to cutting out your lengths. Give yourself plenty of slack because it makes it a lot easier when it comes to tying it up. There's a lot of different ways to truss up a big chunk of meat, but this way I'm gonna show you is the easiest way for me. I just take the string, wrap it around 3 times and cinch it up nice and snug. Because that string is wrapped around 3 times, it is going to hold, and this gives you plenty of time to add just a couple granny knots on top. On this 10-pound quad bone prime rib, I actually used 4 butcher twines. I want to make sure that this is a nice uniform shape. On this chunk of deliciousness, I'm actually doing what some people call a dry brine, but I call it a salt brine. This truly does enhance the flavor to any big chunk of meat. And during the salt brining process, that will actually penetrate deeper into that chunk compared to just having a really salty outer crust. You can use either sea or kosher salt to do this. The longer you salt brine, the better it actually is. But for me on this cook, I'm doing it for 24 hours. A couple hours prior to smoking this prime, I like to take it out of the fridge and just let this chunk of meat breathe. And today, for that extra bonus seasoning, we're gonna do up our prime rib rub. We will have a link in the description below for the amounts needed for this really easy recipe. I'm doubling it because I'm gonna use a little bit of that rub later on in the cook. Here's a pro tip. A lot of times I'll use my coffee grinder for the rosemary and thyme. It's just a lot easier for me than using a knife. But all of you people with the ninja skills, use your knife. And in my opinion, whenever it comes to pulling the little leaves off the thyme, you gotta plan for a little extra time. Not time, but time. Like in a clock. But if you start from the top and work your way down the twig, you can typically get it one stroke at a time. Ugh, never mind the time. Well, you want it for the recipe though. Don't forget about that time. I am gonna give you a quick list of the ingredients needed for this recipe. You will need fresh chopped rosemary, fresh chopped thyme, fresh ground black pepper, smoked paprika, ground mustard, granulated garlic, onion powder, and kosher salt. Because this prime rib was salt brine, we do have a couple different ways that you can actually add and adhere that rub to this prime rib. You can take a couple sticks of softened butter and just add your rub and mix it up and then smear it all over the outside of the meat on that prime rib. Or you can do it the way I'm going to do it today. I take a little bit of olive oil and spread it evenly across that whole chunk of meat. But you don't need a lot. We just want that rub to stick. Then take your rub and put it in a shaker and then spread it evenly across that whole prime rib. You do not have to season up the bottom part of the bones. This is my preferred way to do it because when you do the schmear, most of that butter just melts up and burns up on the bottom of that pan. But don't worry, we're gonna be adding that butter later during the cooking process. Now, just set that prime rib off to the side and let's get your pellet grill fired up. Today, I am using the Traeger Timberline XL. I actually just did a review on this pit a couple weeks back, so if you're interested in learning more about the Traeger XL, we will have a card at the end of this video that you can click on and check it out. I am smoking this prime rib at 225 degrees on this pit because I feel if you cook a prime rib at a lower temperature, you get better results. And running a pit at this temp, I always plan for about 30 minutes per pound. I'm gonna plan for right around 5 hours for a total cook time. Once that Timberline is preheated and settled in, I will leave this American Wagyu on that wire rack with the pan underneath it, but place the thickest part of that prime towards the hottest part of the pit or towards the fire pot. And here is a key tip to help you get a more evenly doneness across that whole prime rib on a pellet grill. I like to do the ricer rotate by turning it 90 degrees every 30 minutes. I actually got this idea from cooking prime rib on my Santa Maria using the rotisserie. And once I started doing it this way on a pellet grill, I actually had a lot happier people around this household because most of us all want a piece that's cooked to medium rare. Another key tip, if available, you want to probe each end of this prime rib. This way you have a reading and have a balance of what the temperature is on both sides. But when I'm probing a prime rib, I do like to back that probe out just a tad. I don't want to read the actual center. I want to read just outside of the center. But it never fails, the larger side starts to fall behind in the temperatures, so sometimes I might leave that side towards the fire pot for an hour before I rotate it so it kind of starts to balance out again. Once I reached around 80 degrees internal temperature, I started to make up my butter bath, and the bonus is it adds a ton of flavor to that outer crust. And seeing that the Timberline XL has an induction plate, I just grabbed a pan and started making it right on this pit. I just melt up 2 sticks of butter and added a couple tablespoons of that prime rib rub. You can also just use a cast iron pan, throw it in your pellet grill and melt that butter in there. Just make sure you mix it up well so those flavors can infuse into that butter. Once you've reached an internal temperature around 90 degrees, then go ahead and start drizzling that butter on. Don't brush it on too hard because you don't want to start rubbing off any of that seasoning that's starting to set. I just repeat this every 30 minutes when I'm rotating that prime rib or until I run out. Because I'm going to add a sear to this prime rib, which also adds a tad of flavor to that crust, we're going to pull it once it's reached an internal temperature about 115 degrees. And then just tent it loosely with some aluminum foil. To add this sear, I'm using a set of grill grates and we're going to preheat this Timberline up to 500 degrees. It typically takes the Timberline XL about 15 minutes to get up to that temp. The amazing part is during that 15 minutes, this prime rib did carry over to about 122 degrees. That's one thing a lot of beginners don't realize, that that chunk of meat is actually going to raise in temperature while it's resting. A medium rare temp is anywhere from 130 to 135 degrees. But you don't want to sear this for too long or you're not going to develop that wall-to-wall pink. You're going to get some grayness starting to settle in. But if you don't sear it long enough, then you're not going to have much more of a carryover to get above that 130 degrees. This step does take a little bit of practice, but if you kind of have an idea where you're supposed to have your temps, you should be able to still nail this at a perfect medium rare. I started out by just letting those bones sit on the grill grates for about 4 to 5 minutes. Then I started to sear each one of those sections on that prime rib for about 30 seconds. With all that butter on that outer crust, it doesn't take very long to set a sear. Pro tip, make sure you have a good set of grilling gloves because that pit is going to get screaming hot. Once I like the color on that sear and have an internal temperature of 125 degrees, I tent it with aluminum foil and let it rest for another 30 minutes. If you want your prime rib a little bit more done, add 5 degrees to each one of these steps. I've reached an internal temperature of 131 degrees on this American Wagyu prime rib. Because I went ahead and separated these bones a little early, how much easier it is to actually get it off this big old prime. So to remove them the rest of the way, just take your slicer and again, just follow along with that bone. This piece right here works great for a midnight snack or throw it in some vegetable beef soup. Like always, we will have links in the description below for everything that you've seen in this video. Plus this prime rib rub and a recipe that you can follow along with. We are just gonna split her kind of right in the middle and see what we've got. Ooh, not bad at all. I will take this anytime. We've got a nice, beautiful pink and a tad bit of a smoke ring from that Traeger Timberline XL. But there's no time like the present. I might as well lop off a chunk and try it out. Gosh, this looks good. And like always, Ricer's making a mess on his cutting board. I need a bigger one. The size of this table. I think this is gonna be pretty much perfect all the way down to the end piece. Remember, this is a Snake River Farms American Wagyu. We gotta try a piece. Talk about tender. That prime rib rub, I'm telling you, if you don't have a clue what to put on the outside of your prime rib, try it. It's really, really good. Just make sure you drizzle some butter on it because that's gonna enhance it even more. Absolutely perfect. This is wall-to-wall pink. You don't want it to be brown and stay around. I really don't have a lot more to add except for I hope you have as much success as I did on your prime rib.